My name is Celeste Monroe, and my life was permanently fractured into two distinct realities. Exactly 5 minutes before I was scheduled to walk down the aisle, I was standing inside the bridal suite of the historic library, my white satin wedding dress, catching the soft ambient light while my fingers trembled against my ribcage in a desperate attempt to slow my frantic breathing before the processional music commenced. The digital screen of my phone began to buzz violently against the marble vanity, a relentless intrusion that threatened to shatter the fragile peace I had spent months trying to preserve from the toxicity of my biological family. I wanted to believe that for once the people who shared my last name could not reach me inside this sacred room, a sanctuary where my fiancé Caleb was already waiting at the altar, and the guests were already seated in expectation of a traditional family celebration. Then, I saw my sister Veronica's name flashing on the screen, her call arriving like an ominous shadow that forced me to pick up the device with a sudden sickening premonition of disaster. Before I could even utter a greeting, she let out a soft little laugh, the specific kind of condescending laugh people weaponize when they want you to know they thoroughly enjoyed orchestrating your emotional ruin. "Don't wait for Dad," she said with absolute coldness. He chose to stand with me. The room fell into an absolute suffocating silence as her words filled the small space like toxic smoke, my voice dropping to a fragile whisper as I asked her how she could possibly execute such a cruelty on my wedding day. She did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second, responding with a sharp arrogance that I should have known my place in the family hierarchy before expecting to be prioritized. My fingers tightened around the phone until my knuckles turned a stark white, the physical pain grounding me, while a deeper psychological agony took root in my chest because a forgotten part of my mind believed her statement instantly. I stared at my reflection in the massive gilded mirror, dressed like a beautiful bride, but feeling entirely like the invisible daughter who had spent an entire childhood being left behind. I remembered every birthday where Veronica demanded more attention, every family dinner where her volatile emotions mattered more than my existence, and every proud milestone where my father Graham Monroe looked away because choosing to celebrate me would make her angry. I realized that the universe was forcing me to walk into that ceremony alone, exposing my abandonment to a crowd of onlookers who would watch me search for a father who simply deemed me easier to leave. The heavy mahogany door behind me swung open with a soft mechanical click, interrupting my spiral before the tears could ruin the meticulous bridal makeup I wore like armor. The woman standing in the doorway was Miriam Clark, a retired school principal who had become more like authentic family to me than anyone who actually shared my bloodline. She took one analytical look at my pale face, then at the vibrating phone in my hand, and closed the heavy door behind her to lock the rest of the world out. "What did she do this time?" Miriam asked with a calm, steady resonance that almost broke my emotional control, because it meant she understood the pathology of my family perfectly. This behavior did not look strange to a woman who had watched me grow up, a woman who had observed the subtle neglect that defined my upbringing from the outer margins. I handed her the device without speaking a word, my sister having already hung up after delivering her calculated blow, but leaving her textual malice behind on the screen. Miriam read the follow-up message Veronica had sent before the call, her weathered face hardening into an expression of pure maternal outrage. As she confirmed the timing of the strike, "She told you this now," Miriam whispered as her mouth tightened into a thin line of absolute disapproval, her fingers gently touching my trembling shoulder to offer a physical anchor. "Cruel people absolutely love timing," she remarked with quiet authority. "It allows them to maximize the psychological damage while pretending the consequences were completely accidental." I attempted to defend my family out of sheer survival habit, stammering that perhaps my father had simply misunderstood the schedule. Or perhaps Veronica had experienced a sudden panic attack that required his immediate presence. Those flimsy excuses had carried me through the minefields of my childhood, but they felt entirely rotten and hollow as I stood there in my wedding gown. Miriam stepped closer to me, her voice echoing with the same strength she used when she guided hundreds of children through their darkest moments. Celeste, your father's failure today is not proof that you are inherently hard to love, she said with absolute certainty. I looked down at the expensive satin of my dress and let out a short laugh that was entirely devoid of humor, asking her why he kept executing actions that proved I was simply the easiest person to abandon. Miriam did not flinch beneath the weight of my despair, because she had known me since I was the quiet girl who volunteered to stay after hours helping teachers clear classrooms because I did not want to return to a home where my presence was a ghost. She was the one who noticed when I stopped, bringing school permission slips back, signed because my father constantly forgot his promises, and my mother Elaine only offered empty reassurances to maintain a superficial domestic peace. Miriam was the entity who sat beside me at my university scholarship ceremony when my father's designated chair stayed completely empty for the duration of the evening. That night, Graham Monroe had driven my sister to a luxury bridal expo in Atlanta because she was aggressively building a glamorous future that demanded his financial and emotional backing. I had stood on that elevated stage with a prestigious academic certificate in my hand, staring at the vacant velvet seat in the front row, while lying to my own heart that the absence did not matter. Miriam had located me later near the corridor vending machines, handing me a cold drink while whispering a sentence that altered my perception forever. A child should never have to pretend an empty chair is normal. Years later, when I channeled that historical pain into a professional career as a school counselor, Miriam had sent a handwritten note to my office, stating that the children who feel invisible would always know I see them, because I carried the map of their loneliness. My father had dismissed my employment as a sweet but entirely impractical endeavor, while Veronica smiled during Sunday dinner and remarked that, of course, I chose a career surrounding broken children because it matched my dull disposition. Everyone at the table had laughed because she delivered the insult with a practiced social charm, and I had laughed along with them because I had been systematically trained by my parents to make their insults smaller for the sake of unity. Miriam looked at me now, my bridal bouquet trembling on the mahogany table beside me, as the overhead clock ticked down to the final 2 minutes before the ceremony. You have spent your entire existence being reasonable so that Veronica looked polished, expensive, and entirely in control of the narrative, moving through the world as if every room was a personal stage she had already claimed. Through sheer force of arrogance, she had built her entire social media career around styling perfect weddings and posting manufactured images of domestic bliss, and now she stood outside mine looking like she had successfully ensured I would remember my marriage for the wrong reason. "There she is," Veronica said, as she slid her phone into her satin clutch. "I was starting to wonder if you were going to hide in that room until the entire audience grew uncomfortable with your isolation." I stopped a few feet away from her physical perimeter, my voice matching the cold stone of the library floor as I demanded to know the geographic location of our father. She tilted her head with a patronizing amusement, asking if I meant the man she had explicitly warned me not to wait for during her phone call. Her eyes flicked toward Miriam with an intense corporate disdain, stating sharply that this was an exclusive family matter that did not require the intervention of an outsider. Miriam stayed perfectly calm beside me, responding with a quiet dignity that if Veronica desired privacy, She should have acted like family instead of a saboteur. Veronica laughed harshly at the defense, mocking the reality that I had to run to an elderly school principal on my wedding day for emotional validation. I stepped forward into her personal space, demanding the exact truth of the words she used to manipulate Graham Monroe into abandoning his paternal duty. I told him the absolute truth. Veronica countered as her smile sharpened into a predatory edge. I told him whatever was necessary to make him realize who actually needed his protection today. She explained that perhaps he chose to stand with her because he finally admitted that she was the daughter who required his constant presence to survive. There it was, the definitive sentence that unmasked our entire childhood architecture. Veronica never actually desired our father's love, unless the acquisition of it proved she could forcefully strip something away from my existence. You love being the noble one, Celeste. Veronica sneered as she swept her eyes over my bridal gown. You have the stable counseling job and the perfect little firefighter husband, while your teacher friends act like you saved the world. She stated that I would easily survive this disappointment because I was engineered to be the strong one. While she was the sister, people actually noticed when she began to fall apart. For one fleeting second, I almost pitied the absolute emptiness that required a sister to sabotage a wedding just to feel visible. But I had spent too many years being lacerated by her pathology to dress her cruelty up as legitimate pain. I informed her with absolute clarity that she had called me 5 minutes before my ceremony because her narcissistic craving for attention could not tolerate a single day where the spotlight was directed at my joy. Her nostrils flared in sudden anger when my voice failed to shake, her defensive posture cracking as she realized the old compliance was entirely gone from my demeanor. Before Veronica could launch another verbal assault, our mother, Elaine Monroe, appeared at the western end of the gallery hall, her hands fluttering nervously as she hurried toward us, with tears already spilling onto her designer dress. Please do not do this here, Elaine whispered in a frantic panic. Not today of all days when everyone is watching us. I turned toward her with an icy detachment, asking her directly if she possessed prior knowledge of my father's plan to abandon his role in the processional. Her face collapsed into a mask of maternal guilt as she avoided my direct gaze, casting a nervous glance toward Veronica that articulated the depth of their collusion far better than spoken words. He was deeply upset, Celeste. Mom stammered defensively. Your sister was having a severe crisis this morning, and everything happened so fast that we thought he would eventually come around before the music started. I went entirely cold, realizing that my own mother had chosen to participate in the silence, choosing to let me stand at the threshold of my future, waiting for a man who had already signed his absence. Veronica rolled her eyes at my silence, accusing me of turning a simple family misunderstanding into a dramatic crime scene for the purpose of garnering sympathy from the guests. You hurt people and call their pain drama, I replied, the statement landing with such weight that the entire hallway fell into an absolute vacuum, where even my mother stopped her manufactured weeping to draw a sharp breath. The wedding coordinator reappeared at the eastern door, her face pale as she announced that the music was synchronized and the ceremony had to commence immediately. Without your father, everyone in that room will spend the afternoon wondering what disgraceful act you committed to make your own family stay away, Veronica whispered, with a venomous satisfaction. That was the ugliest dimension of her design. She had actively imagined the murmurs of the crowd and the look of humiliation on my face, and she had labeled it as truth. Then the heavy side entrance door groaned open behind my mother, and Graham Monroe stepped into the corridor. The look on my father's face told me that the reality of his choice had reached his conscience far too late to preserve his honor, his physical form looking significantly older than it had during our brief breakfast encounter that morning. He stood inside the frame of the side entrance in his formal dark suit, his hand lingering near the brass handle, while his eyes moved, survivalist fashion, from me to Veronica, then to my mother, and finally down to the hardwood floor. My sister's absolute confidence evaporated the moment she realized he had broken their arrangement, her voice cracking as she demanded to know why he had countermanded her instructions to remain away. Dad swallowed hard, his voice carrying a hollow resonance, as he stated he had returned to speak with Celeste before the doors opened. Veronica stepped toward him aggressively, reminding him that they had already discussed the necessity of his absence to prove a point about family loyalty. He flinched at her usage of the word we, exposing the exact lifelong pattern where she did not request his compliance, but simply claimed it through emotional terrorism. I looked at him across the narrow expanse of the hallway, asking him directly if his original intention was to let me stand at the altar, waiting for a ghost while the entire assembly watched my rejection. He opened his mouth to offer a defense, but no coherent sound emerged from his throat, his jaw working silently, while my mother whispered his name in a desperate attempt to minimize the exposure. Miriam stood beside me like a granite pillar, her silent presence offering a profound contrast to the weak vacillation of the man who had authored my childhood insecurity. I was going to arrive before the music changed. Celeste, my father finally articulated, his face tightening when I let out a sharp laugh that cut through his excuse like a razor. Before the music started, or after I had been forced to accept that my father valued my sister's tantrum over my wedding, I demanded to know, my voice remaining low, but commanding the entire trajectory of the confrontation. He rubbed his weathered face with both hands, admitting that Veronica had convinced him that my wedding was an explicit. His eyes flicked toward Veronica in sudden panic, an unspoken admission that confirmed he had participated in the character assassination of his own bride behind closed doors to pacify his eldest daughter. You reward whoever screams the loudest and punish whoever has the dignity to stay quiet, I told him as I stepped into the light of the brass sconce. And then you have the audacity to call the quiet one difficult when she finally finds her voice. My mother cried harder, begging me to look past the timeline because he was here now and willing to fulfill his traditional role. He came because the public narrative of his absence would destroy his social standing, not because his heart was broken by my pain. I clarified with absolute finality. I asked him if he would have ever confessed his plan to me if Veronica hadn't called to gloat, and his absolute silence answered more honestly than his pride ever would. He would have let me wait. He would have let me wonder. He would have watched me break. The wedding coordinator grabbed her clipboard with trembling hands, stating that the musicians had reached the final bars of the prelude, and the doors had to be opened to prevent a scheduling crisis. My father stepped forward, with a desperate panic breaking through his shame, offering his arm to walk me down the aisle, as if the gesture could instantly erase 32 years of calculated neglect. Once I would have grabbed that offer like bread in a famine, lying to my own soul that families make mistakes, and the only reality that mattered was his presence at the threshold. But standing in that narrow tunnel, with the echo of my sister's cruelty still ringing in my ears, I understood the profound difference between a genuine gift and a desperate rescue attempt, designed to protect a perpetrator's reputation. No, I said, the single word freezing the movement of the entire room, as my father blinked in absolute disbelief, and my mother gasped in horror. Veronica's malicious smile reappeared for a fraction of a second, interpreting my refusal as another dramatic wound she could exploit during the reception. Celeste, do not do this to your family, my father pleaded, using the specific soft cadence he weaponized when he desired forgiveness before offering a legitimate apology. I looked at him with an analytical detachment, recognizing the man who had taught me to scan every room for disappointment before allowing myself to experience a shred of joy. This was the individual who remembered every single one of Veronica's photography appointments, heartbreaks, business launches, and manufactured emergencies, but consistently forgot my award nights, my counseling graduation, and my first day at the school, where I dedicated my life to making children feel seen. You do not get to perform fatherhood at the last minute simply because an audience has assembled to watch the performance, I told him, as I stepped backward, out of his physical reach. My mother reached for my lace sleeve, whimpering that despite his flaws, Graham was still my father and deserved the public honor of the aisle. Then he should have acted like a father. Before there was a crowd gathered to evaluate his compliance, I responded, turning my back on their collective panic as I faced Miriam Clark, who had remained silent near the gallery wall. Miriam looked genuinely shocked when my gaze landed on her frame, her hands folding over her chest as she realized I was asking her to step into the center of the most important milestone of my adult life. She had never loved me for an audience. She had loved me in the empty corridors after the school buses had departed, in the quiet libraries where she taught me that an unwanted child is not an unworthy human being. Miriam, I said with a breaking voice, would you honor me by walking me into my future? Tears filled the retired principal's eyes as she realized the depth of the request, her arm offering a steady, unyielding support that contrasted completely with the weak vacillation of my biological lineage. Veronica hissed that I was replacing our father with a retired school administrator, simply to make a pathetic statement in front of our high society guests. Good, I replied as my hands gripped the white roses. Some statements need to be authored in stone so that the world understands the cost of systemic neglect. I am not embarrassing my family, I stated to my father as he lowered his head in absolute social terror. I am simply refusing to hide the reality of the choice you made this morning. The heavy oak doors split open with a grand symphonic sweep, the rich solemn chords of the wedding march exploding into the corridor as the entire assembly rose to their feet on the other side of the threshold. I placed my hand on Miriam's trembling arm, lifted my chin into a straight horizontal line, and stepped forward across the boundary line of my old life. I did not walk down that aisle as the forgotten daughter begging broken people to choose her. I walked as a sovereign woman whom they could no longer control through the leverage of guilt. The moment our feet transitioned onto the polished wood of the restored library, the toxic atmosphere of the corridor dissolved into an environment of golden light, white hydrangeas, and hundreds of faces turning toward the entrance with smiles that slowly shifted into profound confusion. I could feel the collective whisper moving through the rows of guests, the silent questions regarding the absence of Graham Monroe and the presence of the elderly woman who walked with the stride of a protector. For one final microsecond, the old childhood shame rose in my throat, urging me to apologize to the crowd. But Miriam tightened her arm beneath my fingers and whispered two words that anchored my soul. Keep walking. I looked ahead toward the altar and saw Caleb standing in his navy suit, his physical frame completely steady against the backdrop of the arched stained glass windows. His face changed the exact instant he processed the structural layout of the processional, but his expression did not register embarrassment or social anxiety for a single second. He did not look toward my father at the side entrance for permission to understand the reality of the room. He looked directly into my eyes with an immense protective warmth that communicated my trauma did not make me less worthy of absolute joy. When we reached the steps of the altar, Miriam slowly placed my hand into Caleb's strong grip, leaning forward to kiss my cheek while delivering a final blessing that shattered the last remnants of my defense. "You were never hard to love, Celeste." Caleb moved his thumb gently across my knuckles, anchoring my reality as he whispered 3 words that redefined my future. "I've got you." The marriage ceremony commenced with a warm but careful cadence, the officiant steering the narrative back toward the sacred principles of commitment, mutual preservation, and the daily choice of love. I could feel my father's presence, hovering like a dark specter in the back row of the venue, but I refused to turn my head to validate his regret, because I would not allow his historical negligence to occupy the front of my mind during my ascension. When the timeline arrived for the exchange of vows, Caleb spoke first, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the library. I listened to his words with an absolute emotional sobriety, recognizing that he was finally speaking without the defensive guidance of my mother or the terrifying frantic demands of my sister. "I am not angry with you, Dad," I told him, with a soft, steady tone that caused a sudden tear to spill down his weathered cheek. "But forgiveness does not include an automatic restoration of the privileges you abandoned at that library threshold." He nodded his head in absolute agreement, admitting that he had spent the past 12 months in intensive personal therapy, learning how his lifelong cowardice had systematically fractured the psychological development of both his children. He stated that he did not expect an invitation to meet his future grandchild, acknowledging that he had forfeited the right to be a grandfather. The exact second he chose to sit in his vehicle, waiting for Veronica's permission to love me. We stood together in the quiet aisle for 3 minutes, a poignant architectural monument to what could have been, before I wished him well and walked out into the fresh, clean rain. The birth of our daughter, Grace Monroe Clark, occurred during the spectacular height of the spring season, an event that Caleb and I celebrated within a hospital room that was entirely filled with white hydrangeas and the quiet presence of Miriam Clark. I held the fragile newborn against my chest, her tiny fingers curling instinctively around my thumb, while Caleb leaned down to press his lips against my forehead in a gesture of absolute protection. There were no frantic phone calls vibrating on the vanity, no toxic family emergencies, calculated to steal the spotlight from the miracle of a new generation, and no structural anxiety lingering within the perimeter of our sacred space. I looked at my daughter's serene face and made a silent, permanent covenant with her soul that she would never have to grow up scanning rooms for disappointment or shrinking her intelligence to preserve the fragile ego of an abusive sibling. She would never be praised for being low maintenance because her boundaries would be celebrated as the very foundation of her human dignity. The definitive transition from a broken childhood into an unshakable state of absolute domestic peace crystallized. Within the warm light of our newly renovated suburban home, a geographic sanctuary where Caleb and I systematically established our own family traditions far beyond the toxic reach of the remaining Monroe network. The legal paperwork for the complete restructuring of the family property was processed by our attorneys with clinical efficiency, ensuring that the financial assets my father, Graham Monroe, had originally intended to squander on my sister's failed business ventures were legally secured for our daughter's future education. We sat together within the expansive sunlit library of our house, the large panoramic windows framing the ancient oak trees of the surrounding garden, while the gentle breathing of our sleeping newborn filled the background with a comforting biological rhythm. Miriam Clark reached across the heavy timber workstation, her warm weathered fingers closing over my hand with an authentic maternal affection that signaled the complete psychological resolution of the long, emotional war I had waged against the structural ghosts of my upbringing. I looked at the platinum wedding band, resting securely on my finger, realizing that my capacity to love had been thoroughly purified through the terrifying crucible of that library hallway. a dangerous emotional threshold that had ultimately broken my lifelong conditioning and guided us toward a sovereign sanctuary of absolute truth. Outside the brick walls, the autumn wind drove the golden leaves across the quiet streets. But inside the perimeter of our independent reality, the internal friction that had dictated my adult life vanished into a serene state of architectural harmony. The narrative lens executes a final sweeping pan across the interior of the peaceful home, the soft domestic atmosphere suddenly stabilizing into a frame of absolute clarity as the ambient sounds of the household fade into a profound resonant silence. Celeste Monroe appears standing completely alone near the glass doors of the terrace, her white linen dress catching the final brilliant rays of the evening sun, while her physical posture remains remarkably rigid, yet completely devoid of the old survival anxiety. In her right hand, she holds a simple framed photograph from her wedding day, the image capturing the exact microsecond she placed her hand on Miriam's arm to walk down the aisle, while her father stood frozen in the background shadows. Like a historical relic of a bygone regime, her expression is entirely serene and unreadable, her face illuminated by the golden twilight, which reflects in her wide, calm eyes without a single flicker of uncertainty or regret for the boundaries she drew in blood. She does not look back at the hallway or toward the distant city, where her biological lineage remains trapped in their own self-inflicted ruin, choosing instead to turn her head slowly toward the primary viewpoint, looking directly into the lens with an absolute chilling finality that breaks the boundaries between the story and the spectator. She raises her glass of water slightly, as if presenting a final silent toast to the invisible jury of her peers, her lips parting into a faint phantom smile that acknowledges the total completion of her transition from a helpless invisible child into the absolute sovereign architect of her own destinies. The screen drops its color intensity by a single controlled octave as the sunset terminates, the camera remaining completely stationary on her frozen gaze for 5 long suspended seconds before the final light flickers once and the screen slowly fades to a deep, permanent midnight black. The physical departure from the historic library courtyard marked the definitive boundary between my historical conditioning and the uncharted territory of my sovereign future. Caleb held the passenger door of his vintage sedan open for me, his large hand supporting my elbow, while the heavy layers of my satin bridal gown rustled against the leather interior, like the slow settling of winter snow. I looked back through the tinted glass one final time, observing my mother Elaine sitting alone on a stone bench, while my Father Graham stood under a dying string of fairy lights with his hands shoved deep into his tuxedo pockets, as if searching for the ghost of the authority he had squandered. The luxury vehicle accelerated smoothly away from the curb, the brilliant golden illumination of the venue fading rapidly into the rearview mirror, while the quiet urban streets of the city enveloped us in a soothing protective darkness. Caleb reached across the central console to lock his fingers through mine, his skin radiating a consistent grounded warmth that served as the final validation of the long emotional war I had waged to protect my dignity. We drove in absolute silent harmony for 3 miles, a shared sanctuary of peace that required no forced conversation to justify the profound structural changes we had just introduced into the architecture of our families. The morning sun broke through the sheer linen curtains of our new apartment with a soft clinical clarity, illuminating the stacks of unopened wedding gifts and the pristine white roses that I had salvaged from the altar the night before. My digital device began to activate with a series of muted vibrations at precisely 8 o'clock, the screen displaying 14 missed calls from my mother and a massive multi-paragraph text transmission from an unknown digital account that carried my sister's unmistakable linguistic patterns. Veronica had utilized a temporary routing application to bypass my security blocks. Her text, executing a lengthy, erratic tirade that accused me of destroying her professional reputation among the local event coordinators who had witnessed her public expulsion. She claimed that 3 major bridal clients had already cancelled their styling contracts within hours of the reception, transforming her designed victory into an absolute financial disaster that she blamed entirely on my refusal to comply with her traditional sabotage. I deleted the entire transmission without reading past the initial paragraph, my hand remaining perfectly steady as I guided the phone into the deep drawer of the bedside table to prevent her chaotic energy from infiltrating the clean perimeter of our first domestic morning. The transition back into my professional routine as a school counselor provided an essential psychological anchor during the volatile weeks that followed the public fracture of the Monroe family hierarchy. I sat within my small campus office with its walls lined with children's artwork and clinical literature, listening to a 10-year-old boy explain how he constantly altered his behavior at home to minimize his stepfather's unpredictable emotional outbursts. I recognized the precise defensive architecture of his words, the ancient familiar strategy of becoming entirely low maintenance to secure a fragile semblance of safety within a household that treated his vulnerability as a personal inconvenience. I guided him through a series of boundary exercises with absolute patience, validating his hidden anger, while confirming that his worth was not dependent on his ability to pacify the adults who were engineered to protect him. When he departed the room with a lighter stride, I looked at the small silver-framed photograph of Miriam Clark. Veronica reacted to his public confession as if he had forcefully slapped her across the face in front of her professional peers, rushing into the center aisle to demand that he terminate this ridiculous public display of self-pity. She screamed that I was actively manipulating the entire room to look like a saintly victim, her polished exterior completely evaporating to reveal the hollow predatory nature underneath. Caleb stepped slightly in front of my physical frame, his arm forming an unyielding human shield, as he informed Veronica with absolute calm that this ceremony did not belong to her pathology and that her control had ended at the threshold. Miriam Clark turned from her seat in the front row, her voice cutting through the rising panic with the sharp precision of a veteran educator. A sister who possessed an ounce of authentic love would have protected this moment at all costs. Veronica flushed a violent crimson as she looked around the room, finally realizing that the audience was not seeing a charming wedding stylist or a flawless older sister. They were seeing a saboteur, unmasked by her own words. My father's voice thundered through the rafters one final time, commanding her to cease her assault before she could finish destroying the remaining fragments of our family identity. That word enough landed with a completely different structural power this time, because it came before she could complete the execution of her damage, forcing her to look at him as if her protector had suddenly transformed into a total stranger. The power she had weaponized for decades depended entirely on his willingness to shield her from the consequences of her behavior, and in that golden library, that protection stopped permanently. I turned back toward Caleb, informed the officiant that I was ready to get married, and we exchanged our platinum rings with completely clear hearts. When the officiant officially pronounced us husband and wife, the applause that erupted from the rows of guests did not sound like a standard wedding celebration. It sounded like a massive collective sigh of relief from an audience that had witnessed a historic act of liberation. We walked back down the aisle together while the music soared toward the vaulted ceiling, my hand locked in Caleb's grip like an absolute anchor, while the ghosts of my childhood faded into the background noise of the ovation. Outside in the open brick courtyard, the reception was illuminated by thousands of warm fairy lights, white roses clustering on the tables, while the autumn air carried the crisp scent of a new season. For the first time in 32 years, I allowed myself to believe that my existence could be simple, beautiful, and entirely separated from the heavy architecture of family dysfunction. But a narcissist like Veronica does not vacate the spotlight without attempting to burn the theater down to the ground for noticing someone else's light. I observed her near the western edge of the courtyard, her voice rising in a sharp, venomous pitch as she accused our father of humiliating her career for the sake of the invisible daughter. The courtyard grew progressively quiet as the guests began to tune into the perimeter conflict, watching my father stand his ground with a new structural integrity that shame had finally produced where love had failed for decades. "No, Veronica, you completely humiliated yourself today," my father responded with a heavy finality that signaled the permanent closing of a historical door. Veronica laughed in absolute disbelief, demanding to know how he could defend a daughter who had replaced his paternal honor with a school administrator in front of the local event community. A prominent woman who owned a local corporate venue stepped forward from a nearby table, asking Veronica directly if the rumors were true, that she had called the bride 5 minutes before the processional to falsely announce her father's abandonment. Veronica's face shifted into an expression of absolute professional terror as she realized this was no longer a private domestic dispute. It was a catastrophic commercial disaster unfolding in front of the exact wedding industry network she spent her life trying to impress. She began to stammer too fast that I had twisted the narrative, but I stepped forward into the circle of light before Caleb could intervene to shield me. "Then say exactly what your intention was, Veronica," I commanded with an absolute serene calm that completely disarmed her chaotic rage. "I was simply tired of watching everyone act like you are an innocent saint while you play small and wounded to garner affection." Veronica screamed, her voice shaking with an intense narcissistic rage that revealed her confession was permanently dressed up as self-pity. "I just wanted our father to prove that my existence still mattered more than your wedding," she shouted into the quiet courtyard. My residual fear left my psychology completely as I looked at her, my voice dropping to a steady, horizontal resonance, as I told her that she had always mattered enough to be invited into my joy and stand beside me, but she desired my complete humiliation because sharing love was a concept her emptiness could never comprehend. "You think you won some sort of game, Celeste," she sneered as she stepped forward with another insult prepared to launch. Before her fingers could make contact with mine, Vale, the venue security team, and Caleb's fellow paramedics stepped between our frames with a clinical efficiency that required no physical violence to articulate the boundary. The venue manager looked at her with an absolute corporate coldness, stating that her invitation had been legally revoked and it was time for her immediate removal from the property. Veronica looked toward our father, waiting for the lifelong rescue pattern to manifest and pull her out of the fire she had lit herself. But Graham Monroe remained completely stationary, with his arms folded across his chest. That was her authentic execution. Not the whispers of the elite guests, not the professional ruin of her styling brand, but the reality that the man who had always protected her from the consequences of her cruelty had finally left her to stand inside them alone. She was forcefully escorted out through the iron side gates of the courtyard, her screams echoing down the historic street until the heavy metal latched shut with a definitive mechanical clang that altered the geometry of the evening. When the gate closed, the courtyard felt entirely different. It did not feel perfect or healed, but it felt remarkably honest and clean for the first time in my existence. My father approached our table later in the evening, after Caleb and I had completed our first dance under the golden lights, stopping a few feet away from my chair without requesting an immediate unearned absolution from his daughter. "I see the reality of what I authored now, Celeste," he said with wet eyes, "and I know that seeing it decades late does not erase the scars I left on your childhood." I looked at his face for a long period of silence, a part of my soul wanting to run into his arms, because daughters do not automatically stop craving their fathers simply because their fathers failed them in practice. But a stronger version of my identity understood that trading an honest boundary for instant superficial repair would simply invite the old pathology back into my marriage. If you desire a functional relationship with the woman I have become, it cannot be constructed on the condition of my silence. I informed him with absolute precision. You do not get to call my legitimate pain drama. You do not get to weaponize the word family to force me to accept systematic disrespect. And you do not get back the sacred role you abandoned today with a single evening of remorse.